Your Excellencies, colleagues, partners and friends, those in the room here today and those joining us online, a very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to Civil Society Reflections on the 2023 report of the Secretary-General on activities of the United Nations system in implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. My name is Ilko Kessels. I am the Executive Director of the Global Center on Cooperative Security, and I am delighted that so many of you are able to join us today here at the ECOSOC chamber at the UN headquarters, as well as online. We have many people connecting from all across the world, demonstrating the level of interest and importance that civil society attaches to the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy review process and their eagerness to engage in violence prevention efforts. Today's discussions are taking place in the exact room where this morning member states started their biannual review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, with final negotiations and adoption of the review resolution scheduled for June 2023. The review of the strategy provides an important opportunity to reflect on the changing nature of the terrorism threat landscape, assess UN and member states' implementation of the strategy, and set priorities for the years to come. And in so doing, member states can also direct the normative role of the United Nations, optimize its complex counterterrorism architecture, and focus its counterterrorism and PVE efforts. Last Friday, member states had the opportunity to be briefed by the Undersecretary-General of the UN Office of Counterterrorism on the report of the Secretary-General. Today's event complements that briefing by centering civil society reflections and voices. We encourage member states to account for the perspectives that are going to be shared today as they engage in the negotiation process and seek to improve rights-compliant counterterrorism and PVE efforts. I wish to express my thanks to the co-facilitators of the 8th Biannual Review, the permanent representatives of Canada and of Tunisia to the United Nations, for their support for this event, which offers civil society an opportunity to inform the strategy review process from the outset. And on the margins of the review process, the Global Center is leading its Blue Sky process, an independent evaluation of UN counterterrorism efforts that's now in its 6th iteration. Integral to this process is advancing the rule of law, protecting and promoting human rights, engaging civil society, and safeguarding civic space. We look forward to working with all of our partners in this important process and to realize its recommendations and outcomes. For those joining us online, we are pleased to offer simultaneous interpretation of the event. And now it is my honor to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Robert Ray, Permanent Representative of Canada, followed by His Excellency Ambassador Tarek Ladeb, Permanent Representative of Tunisia, for the opening remarks, after which my colleague Melissa Leffes, the Global Center's Chief of Strategy, will pick up the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to join you all today. I'm going to speak very briefly, just to say that together with Ambassador Ladeb, we're looking forward very much to hearing from you. As you know, this process is one that is, I would say, driven and belongs to member states, but it's deeply informed by the comments and the concerns that are expressed by all of you and the organizations and very diverse organizations that you represent. We have begun the process of discussion about what we hope will be a consensus document. It will be very much built on the consensus that was arrived at last year. And we are looking forward to hearing your views. As will be a number of member states who I see around the room are represented here listening together with me and members of the Secretariat to what it is that you have to say. Speaking very personally, I can say that in another life, I was a member of the Security and Intelligence Review Committee of the Government of Canada, whose responsibility it was to act as a review mechanism for the Central Intelligence and Security Intelligence Agencies of Canada. And I also was responsible for a report on assessing the Air India bombing, which had taken place 20 years before I wrote the report, and its ongoing impact on our national life. I think we all start from a couple of foundational points, at least we certainly do in Canada. The first foundational point is that any threat to human security is a threat to one, is a threat to all of us. And it's something that we have to recognize as a genuine global menace. At the same time, we also are very proud of the institutions that we have established both globally and nationally that protect civil liberties and the rights of the citizen and the rule of law. So that is the basis from which we start. We call it in the work that we're doing on the resolution the 4 pillars. The Security Council has assisted us in 2664 in further specifying what we're up to. But I'm going to say that I look forward very much in this session to hearing and also knowing that this engagement does not end today. It's an engagement that continues, and so we look forward to carrying on a dialogue with you and with your organizations to begin to understand better what kinds of changes and issues that you want to raise with us. We're very happy to hear about them. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Dear colleagues, representatives of civil society and UN entities, at the outset I would like to thank the Global Center for convening this important meeting, which comes along the starting of the 8th review process of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. We had this morning a very positive meeting with member states to present our zero draft, and we listened to their preliminary comments and priorities. As me and Bob have mentioned before, we intend to run this process in an inclusive and holistic manner in close cooperation and collaboration with all the stakeholders, member states, UN entities, civil society, of course, and all other stakeholders who should unite in combating the scourge of terrorism and violent extremism through a comprehensive and multidimensional response, as it remains a serious threat to peace and security in all over the world, and as it continues to expand and evolve. We believe that the efforts of all the stakeholders are needed for a wider perspective and for a balanced and more effective implementation of the global strategy. In this regard, civil society can play an important role at many levels to support and strengthen countering and preventing terrorism and violent extremism, and to contribute to calibrating the global response to this threat. In this connection, civil society organizations' contributions are essential in addressing and preventing the conditions conducive to terrorism, in minimizing the appeal of terrorist agenda online, and in building societal resilience to terrorism, and in generating awareness and popular support to the implementation of the 4 pillars of the strategy. We will listen to your views and contribution, and we will keep always ready for any further meetings with you along this process. I thank you.
My thanks to the co-facilitators for your leadership in engaging with civil society in the review process and to ensure that the process is informed by a wide range of stakeholders. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Leffis. I'm the Chief of Strategy at the Global Center, and I am truly honored to be facilitating the discussion today with a terrific all-women panel. Our speaker bios are around the room and on the chat function online. For our discussion, following the Q&A, we will have the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, who will provide her own reflections, followed by a series of interventions from civil society from around the world, and closing remarks by the Deputy to the Undersecretary General and Director to the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, Rafi Grigorian. I would like to just jump right into the substance of our discussion and give as much of the airtime to our partners and take advantage of their expertise from around the world. We have invited them to reflect on the current counterterrorism landscape and the role that the UN can play in enhancing a rights-compliant approach to counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism. I would like to address my first question to you, Ms. Hamsatu Alamin. Hamsatu, as an educator, a human rights and women's activist in rural communities in northeast Nigeria, you have become a trusted negotiator and peacemaker between militants and security forces. Following the abduction of nearly 300 schoolgirls from Chibok in 2014, it was you who held the first press conference that brought public attention at the national and international level of the crisis. Today, you are here with us in the ECOSOC chamber addressing member state negotiators of the 8th UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review. Why is it important to you for civil society to participate in this process?
Your Excellencies, my noble colleagues, good afternoon. In fact, as a civil society actor, like any other civil society responsible, let me put that in quote, we are playing very, very critical roles of first responders during crisis, empowering survivors, victims, and communities, enhancing resilience, supporting accountability and transparency, advancing the rule of law, and thus working to achieve the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is therefore very, very important that our presence in this chamber and then relating with it, engaging with it, cannot be overemphasized. In Nigeria, my country, my Alamin Foundation works inclusively with all stakeholders with a human rights approach at the heart of all our intervention that are victims and survivor-centered and specifically tailored towards countering and preventing violent extremism. Thus, we have challenged the narrative of Boko Haram from Boko Haram to, that is, we have challenged the narrative of extremism from Boko Haram to Boko Halal. Yes, so that we catch our children young with messages of peace, peaceful coexistence and tolerance and living with people who are not Muslims in a peace club setting in Islamic schools. We have created 8 victims and victims' relations social networks, including those of the survivors of sexual slavery and their invisible children, then that of mothers and then wives of victims of disappearances and others. And then we have also brought women and youth from faith-based organizations, built their capacity so that they can effectively respond to the growing mistrust and differences between Christians and Muslims, thus build a movement of women and youth, peacemakers, as bridge builders to close the gaps created by the Boko Haram insurgency. For the first time ever, we have started engaging with Boko Haram women in a community-based de-radicalization program.
In progress.
Yes, the radicalization process to demystify the radical ideologies in their heads, minds, and psyche, and then save them and the children they are carrying and cutting them off from the chains of further infecting our society. But the extremism in our context is assuming a very, very new dimension with voluntary mass surrender of over 100,000 fighters of recent. I think this is for the first time in the world, maybe you may be hearing that over 100 people, fighters, have surrendered to authorities. While, in fact, the women and the children among those of these fighters have already filtered silently into the community, while the government itself is overwhelmed by the mass surrender and then the other emerging situations. Our host communities are therefore engulfed in fear, concerns and frustration of never being catered for while contending with millions of out-of-school children and food security issues. While also the community of victims and their relations whom people like me work with their invisible children. When I say invisible, I'm referring to the children who are conceived and born while their mothers are either in captivity with the Boko Haram or while in state detention facilities. So that, yes. So, yes, where am I? While contending with the community of victims, so the community of victims are contending with their invisible children of the violence from both sides of the conflict without any remedies from any quarter. These are all conditions and atmosphere. Your Excellencies, you will agree with me that these are all conditions and atmosphere that are favorable to violent extremism and then terrorism, hence needing immediate attention in the global counterterrorism strategy. Finally, you will all agree with me, Your Excellencies and colleagues, that the reality of the situation I have shared must inform, in fact, national and international counterterrorism efforts. Let me stop here and give my other colleagues chances too.
Thank you so much, Hamsatu, for underscoring just how important it is to bring the voice of partners like yourselves that are working at the community level to relay the realities that are very difficult. My next question is for you, Laura. At Access Now, you defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world, including through comprehensive policy engagement and advocacy here at the UN. Over the past years, the UN has been expanding its counterterrorism efforts to address terrorist use of wide-ranging technologies, including AI, biometrics, and surveillance technologies. Can you unpack what a rights-based approach looks like in taking this work forward? What should member states understand about your field of expertise as they negotiate the 8th strategy review?
Thank you very much, Melissa, Your Excellencies, and colleagues for inviting Access Now to this important civil society-led discussion. To start off, it is important to note that at Access Now, we currently do not conduct direct advocacy on counterterrorism. I am by no means a counterterrorism expert, but as you rightfully highlighted, Melissa, the UN is expanding its counterterrorism efforts within the realm of technology in ways that impact human rights. Now, with the Delhi Declaration and the Secretary General's report that we are here to discuss, we hear alarm bells. Counter-terror activities in digital spaces are already impacting human rights and will not succeed absent vastly improved transparency and oversight. These safeguards must be baked not only into process, but also substance, not merely mentioned in passing or to show how tech-savvy one is, or as a rubber stamp exercise. A transparent and rights-based approach will ensure that counterterrorism is not used to curtail, to restrict, or ultimately diminish human rights worldwide, and to ensure accountability for member states and private actors alike. The international human rights framework has been remarkably resilient despite the onslaught of new technology that defines our digital age. The framework that affirms the rights to privacy, freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association apply online as well as offline. While these rights are not absolute and can be restricted, these restrictions must be in line with certain principles of legality, legitimacy, necessity, proportionality, and non-discrimination. Now, the UN institutions, procedures, as well as international courts have provided important guidance on addressing the impact of digital technologies on human rights, such as the adoption of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council resolutions on the right to privacy in the digital age, as well as new and emerging technologies. Finally, in order to unpack what this rights-based approach looks like, I want to narrow in on a specific example, and that is of encryption and virtual private networks, which are both referenced in the Secretary General's report. We all use encryption in our daily lives, whether it's to secure electronic banking and financial transactions or to exchange sensitive information such as healthcare data. Further, for some victims of internet shutdowns and invasive surveillance, Using a VPN helps mitigate the negative impacts, protecting access to life-saving information. Now that's something that we can all relate to recently amid the COVID-19 pandemic. From a human rights perspective, encryption and VPNs protect individuals and communities by providing critical information infrastructure. In the Secretary General's report, encryption and VPNs are mentioned only once and negatively as a technology or tool in the context where terrorist groups plan attacks, including cyber attacks. Now, this is, of course, an important challenge, but by framing VPNs and encryption solely as a problem, this ignores how VPNs and encryption protect human rights, especially for journalists, human rights defenders, domestic violence and trafficking victims, and for everyone, by allowing confidence in our digital lives. Now, to conclude, because I know I'm under time constraints, I do want to make 3 calls of action to member states and to private actors. First, disclosures. For example, the orders that state issue to tech and telecom companies to shut down the internet, or their standards to vet surveillance tool vendors. The judiciary, parliament, and the public should be informed as to the legal basis and justifications for these rights-impacting policies and measures, and have that debate openly. Second, we need more information on threats companies see across cyber domains, content platforms, and disinformation campaigns, among others. We support regular transparency reporting and mandatory human rights due diligence by the industry. And finally, civil society must be involved in the oversight. One popular regulation in cities across the U.S. involves civilian oversight of police procurement of surveillance technologies. We monitor misuse and surface threats early. Listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for highlighting the urgency to improve transparency and oversight in this space. This is a perfect segue over to Mary McCord, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law. You have been building your extensive expertise litigating acts of terrorism and tracking the emergence of violent right-wing extremism in the U.S. Drawing on that experience, how should concerns about human rights abuses and other unlawful and arbitrary applications of terrorism laws be addressed?
Thank you for the opportunity to address this group today and to be here. So yesterday, the U.S. intelligence community released its annual threat assessment. And included in that threat assessment, the U.S. intelligence community said that transnational, racial, and ethnically motivated violence, which is similar to the XRIRB extremist violence as that term is used in the Secretary General's report, is the most lethal terrorist threat in the United States right now and is a significant threat in many member states. This, like all forms of terrorism, demands a counterterrorism response. But criminal enforcement of terrorism laws is an area that is susceptible to abuses of power, where there is a lack of adherence to the rule of law. Too often, counterterrorism laws can be used for reprisal, to target disfavored individuals or groups, or to suppress human rights, including the rights to speech and expression. Commitment to the rule of law is a key pillar in implementing any counterterrorism regime. And in my long tenure in the Department of Justice up until and through mid-2017, it is how we tried to build that program. Within states, the rule of law refers to a system of laws that the people and the government agreed to abide by. It requires transparency, stability, and predictability in the enactment and the enforcement of laws. It requires a fair legal process where rights and responsibilities are evenly enforced, and it requires diverse, competent, and independent judicial tribunals. So what does this really mean? Adherence to the rule of law means that crimes of terrorism must not be vague or overbroad, leaving too much discretion to those who enforce those laws. Laws must give clear notice about what conduct is prohibited. They must respect human rights, and they must not discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, gender orientation, socioeconomic status, or political ideology. And the laws must apply to all, the government and the governed. Adherence to the rule of law also means there must be accountability. a system for seeking redress of grievances that provides a fair opportunity to be heard by neutral decision makers who are committed to following the law. These decision makers themselves must be accountable for their actions through transparency in their proceedings and decision making and through other institutional mechanisms. Without adherence to these principles, the potential for abuse will inhibit the success of any counterterrorism strategy, as it will not have the respect and the trust of the population and will not earn their cooperation. I thank you for the opportunity to address this group.
Thank you so much, Mary. One of the key components of the rule of law is the human rights principle of equal human dignity and non-discrimination, which underpin the international commitment to equality before the law. Rima Salah, throughout your career, you have been an advocate for the rights of women and children in armed conflict and post-conflict situations. Your role as a board member of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, a coalition of over 100 women's organizations around the world, is but one example of your work with civil society. During one of our discussions, you mentioned that language in UN resolutions on gender and civil society doesn't always reflect practice. How can the UN and member states support women leaders and peace builders to ensure the effective prevention of conflict and violence and overcome barriers of participation and protection? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues. Member states, the UN, and other multilateral institutions can better support women leaders and peace builders by ensuring that they can meaningfully and equally participate in decision-making on the prevention of conflict and violence. Local women must participate in the design and implementation of programs on conflict and violence prevention. The practice of consultation without influence in decisions, or as we say, add women and stare approach, cannot work. It is not effective, and it violates the right of women to participate in policymaking and decision-making as enshrined in CEDAW and the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the supporting resolution on women, peace, and security. I also call on all stakeholders to support the efforts of women and youth peace builders in preventing conflict and violence, particularly those who live and work in local communities affected by conflict and crisis. The Global Network of Women Peace Builders has a very effective program called Localization of Women, Peace and Security that is implemented in 21 countries such as Colombia, Congo, Kenya, Lebanon, Nepal, Philippines, and Uganda. The Global Network for Women Peace Builders Localization of Women Peace and Security program has been cited multiple times as a key strategy in the implementation of the Women Peace and Security resolutions by the UN Secretary General in his reports to the Security Council. It is a people-based, bottom-up strategy that is based on the premise that local ownership and participation lead to more effective policy making and implementation. It convenes key local actors, including indigenous leaders and traditional leaders, religious leaders, women leaders, youth leaders, local police, military personnel, and others to participate in workshops on the localization of women, peace, and security. And they formulate also local action plans, local legislation, and integrate resolutions into community development. Additionally, some local leaders in partnership with national government, ministries, and agencies opt to produce localization guidelines, and all those guidelines are in different languages. I also want to share a few examples of the impact of the localization of women, peace, and security in the Philippines and in Kenya. the localization programs resulted in the appointment of women to key local council positions traditionally held by men. For example, a woman who participated in the localization process was appointed to the country assembly in Kenya in recognition of her peace-building work. Also in the Philippines, women have been appointed as leaders in peace and security in their villages. In Uganda, localization has increased awareness of the importance of reporting sexual and gender-based violence, which is also very important. And so the local action plan with concrete provisions, prevention and management was adopted in each district of the country. Also, the most important thing is that a gender-based violence desk and community liaison officers were established after the localization also in those countries. Also, what is important is that women, peace and security, and young and youth, peace and security are working together. So my appeal to you to support women and youth as they work every day to build peace in their communities, to build peace and social cohesion in their communities. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Rima, for that clear call to action that's resonating in the room, and I'm sure with our participants around the world. And I appreciate your emphasizing some of the good practices and examples that other member states can use as models in their work. You also identified a very challenging and difficult subject of sexual and gender-based violence. And here I would like to turn to Hamsatu to share your recommendations. I think this is a topic that's very dear to you, and to share your recommendations to the UN and member states.
Yes. Thank you very much. In fact, what I shared with you earlier, the kind of participation we do is not without any risk. But I'm happy to tell you that I have never been threatened by the extremists in our context, rather by state actors. So therefore, this poses a barrier for us to effectively participate as a civil society actor and then add value to whatever that is taking place. So in view of this, in view of what I have shared earlier, the value of what we add cannot be overemphasized. Hence, we have developed certain recommendations to Your Excellencies and then the members of the UN family as a takeaway from this meeting. Number one is, I said, watch out for spoilers and sustain engagements with civil society, and then stamp out the maneuvers that will eventually squeeze the civil spaces and further alienate the voices of civil society, and particularly of women across. For these are the only avenues. When I say this, I mean the civil society actors and then the voices of women are the only avenue where the UN can learn of some of the growing ungoverned spaces. Secondly, I said encourage member states, members of the international community, that is the UN should encourage members of the international community, like the bilaterals and the multilaterals, including the UN agencies, to invest in building local capacities at the grassroots level, and then develop the skills of the civil society in fragile contexts like ours, as well as focus on networking us and protecting us, for these are the fertile breeding ground of all violent extremism and conditions conducive for extremism. When I say this, in fact, there isn't much of the localization taking place, particularly in the areas that I mentioned. If it were the bilaterals, they would say civil society has no capacity, therefore. And then in those contexts, then, eventually, when the conflict ends or resources fizzle out, who then stands and then take over whatever that is the initiative that is started? Then I said you should widen the engagement in all thematic areas of interest with networks and then groups like the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights, the Global Center on Cooperative Security, the Security Policy Alternative Networks, the Women Alliance for Security Leaderships, and others on areas that include technology, gender, and finances, etc., while exploring potential other bodies to work with. And then I said, the UN should ensure compliance, or member states' compliance to resolutions and calls to action. That is an area that is where we are having challenges. I am a Nigerian. I had the privilege of speaking for about 4 times in different capacities, including participating in a UN Security Council debate. But whenever I speak, my country's desk is always empty. So at home, my country, Nigeria, I don't have the opportunity to get my state actors to listen to our voices. And then in forum like this, nobody makes them or compels them to come and be listening. So these are what I am referring to in this. So I hope the UN can take action along that to ensure that member states comply with whatever resolutions that are passed. And then put a monitoring mechanism in place, inclusive of civil society representatives. For this will reinforce the political will of member states and also add to the protection of civil society actors, as well as guaranteeing our security in fragile contexts. Another thing I want to share here and then recommend something is the recruitment of young people, boys and girls, women, and then young people by extremists. Once recruited, in fact, indoctrinated and radicalized, women and children are subjected to the brutal induction processes, and girls experience rape and other forms of violent, sexual violence, including sexual slavery. So boys and girls continue to be used to serve as combats, yes, including the girls themselves. While many of our colleagues don't want to see us women as perpetrators, but they continue to serve as combatants and then play supporting roles. But while the boys and girls continue to be targeted disproportionately, girls, in addition, continue to be used by state actors and by both the state and non-state actors in different other forms. But at the end, the girls continues to be disadvantaged in accessing disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration assistance for a variety of reasons. Include the refusal of the combatants to release them into transit care facilities, as was the case in 2005 in Liberia and Sierra Leone, the DRC, and in Nigeria currently, where the Boko Haram, when surrendering, before they surrender, they will just push their wives and then children before, and then they come and be accepted and then fizzle into the communities. But unfortunately, these girls and women and then the children are equally dangerous, if not even more than the men themselves. And then, so therefore, we wish to call, emphasize on the need to identify such women and children who are not easily to find, because you wouldn't know. They are just women like me. Unless they voluntarily or wish to tell you who they are, you wouldn't know who they are, but dangerous and then whatever they are. So therefore, we have to devise, and the only way you can get to this is through civil society actors who are very much locally rooted in their communities, so that they can be targeted and the relevant interventions being taken to de-radicalize them. Anyway, these are just a few of recommendations that I am able to develop in the context I am working. I thank you all for your attention, time, and then the opportunity of given to us to air some of these views and then the findings in our context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hamsatu. And I would draw attention to the recommendations that emerged from the UN Women-led process of a global digital consultation of civil society, where many of these messages are reiterated. Laura, we are witnessing several parallel intergovernmental processes in the field of new and emerging technologies. The Christchurch Call to Action, the Delhi Declaration, a cybercrime convention expected in the next session of the UN, and a global digital compact, to name but a few. Having participated in many of these processes, what advice do you have for UN and member states representatives wishing to advance policy and technical assistance in this area?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. There are quite a few overlapping processes, and I think the pandemic has brought the digital track to the forefront, and the UN itself is still struggling to operate online and juggle all these work streams. Nonetheless, the majority of these parallel processes, especially some of the ones that you just mentioned, center on human rights as part of the core function of that mandate. For instance, the Global Digital Compact has a specific thematic deep dive into human rights online. There's two important points I want to raise as advice for UN and for member state representatives wishing to advance policy and technical assistance in this area. The first is to recognize the importance of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Not only is UN human rights the normative lead with the relevant and increasingly thematic or technical expertise, the agency is also familiar with all relevant UN processes and overlapping initiatives to date. For example, UN human rights supports the mandates of the special procedures, including UN Special Rapporteurs on these intersecting topics. They are tasked to study the human rights risks through resolutions, recently including a report on internet shutdowns, and have been instrumental, truly, in guiding discussions on topics such as cybercrime. The regional desks at UN Human Rights also closely monitor security threats and sound early warnings. So we cannot underestimate the importance of this and this role of this UN agency. And the second point I want to raise is, in addition to the efforts of UN human rights, civil society, as been demonstrated today, is not only identifying but also analyzing the risks from the grassroots to the global level. And the Secretary General's report mentioned the alarming issue of internet blackouts, or as we more commonly refer to them as internet shutdowns. But as the Secretary General's report fails to analyze in more detail the impact of shutdowns on counterterrorism efforts. So we at Access Now, we lead a Keep It On coalition of more than 300 organizations from 105 countries around the world fighting internet shutdowns. And in 2022, we recorded 187 internet shutdowns in 35 countries. Our analysis shows that the year was marked by the weaponization of shutdowns during armed conflict, a continued resurgence of disruptions during protests, and the entrenchment of repeat and prolonged shutdowns. With 48 shutdowns in 14 countries coinciding with documented human rights abuses, the human cost of internet shutdowns has never been more clear. Shutdowns increase polarization and decrease access to life-saving information and open source intelligence during conflicts. Shutting down the internet is not an effective anti-terrorism measure and may in fact be counterproductive by reducing opportunities for open dialogue and for sharing of legitimate information. Civil society has this analysis and data, and it shares it closely with UN Human Rights. Some of that information sharing takes place at RightsCon, our annual summit on human rights and technology, which will take place in Costa Rica in June, and to which we invite you all to discuss these important topics. And in conclusion, we strongly encourage those working on counterterrorism to lean in on these sources of the UN human rights, of civil society, of defenders around the world as pillars of support in navigating these many processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Those are very, very clear examples that you've given. And also for highlighting the role of UN human rights bodies and civil societies in this space. This actually allow me to stray a little bit from our agenda, because I think I would really love to hear from the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism before we turn back to our panel. Professor Nieline, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you all. Very sorry not to be in person. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity and to engage with you all remotely. Excellent ladies and gentlemen, in particular to the co-chairs of facilitating this process, Ambassador Ledeb and Ambassador Ray. I really warmly welcome both your framing remarks, and your words really carry enormous weight as you articulate the importance of including civil society in this process, and I think continues what we've seen as really a sea change over the past processes of the GCTS, which is meaningful, sustained inclusion of civil society, which has defined the last process and I hope continues to define this one. And the reason why that's important is not just because I think we think civil society are good people to have in the room, but actually we all produce better policy when we include a diverse group of stakeholders and voices from the ground to hear and to listen to them as we try to craft a counter-terrorism strategy that's fit for purpose, fit for the challenges we face. And it's just really important to underscore what we might call the value proposition of civil society. We've heard it with these extraordinary panelists today. We see it in the work we do every day in all of the places that we are trying as the UN to advance human rights, rule of law, and successful, efficient counterterrorism policies. Civil society is always the best of us. They hold a deep reservoir of knowledge. They have facets across relationships in society as a whole that few of us have access to. And they're particularly important in the context of the global rise of authoritarianism and backsliding democracy. Civil society is, in a sense, both our early warning system on the robustness and the resilience of our societies. And they're also a way to tell us what's working and what's not working on the ground. So we need civil society to make better policy. And if we don't include them, and that means including them consistently in this strategy review process, dare I say it, we end up with pretty vacuous, often unconnected policy to the realities on the ground that are driving radicalization, driving cycles of violence. And without them, we will not produce in the UN, but member states in their efforts are not going to produce the solutions that are capable of really preventing the cycles of violence that have defined terrorism and conflict over the past 2 decades in multiple societies. So we have many, many lessons to learn. And I'm not saying that the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review is where we're going to learn them all. But the review process gives us a moment of pause as member states and all stakeholders to really think about and understand what we can better. Now, I do want to say that it is really clear that the current global counterterrorism strategy from the last review has significantly improved language on civil society. And we owe an enormous debt of thanks to the co-chairs, Oman and Spain, who led by example. And it is, I think, important to say that this is this consensus language that we have in the current global counterterrorism strategy is a consensus that reflects an evolving view of states, of the value of civil society itself. I also want to say that we've seen significant developments since the strategy was agreed, which is the Malaga conference, and in particular to member states and to the co-chairs, I commend the civil society outcome document from that process, which really gives you a wealth of tools to speak to the value that civil and the insights that civil society bring to this process. As far as the Secretary General's report, let me say briefly, Melissa, I do again welcome the work that's been done in this report. And again, it's recognition of the status quo of where we are in relation to including civil society is important. But I think it's also important, as Access Now has just articulated, that we don't see the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review as separate from the other cognate, priorities that have been emerging across the UN system and their articulation in other policies. And so, for example, as the SG's report defines a threat landscape, it seems to me somewhat of a missed opportunity that instead of taking a sort of a, if you want, maybe a 2020, not taking a new approach to thinking about the range of challenges on the threat landscape, the range of ways in which poor governance, poor rule of law, lack of oversight on the security sector, and the misuse of technology by terrorist groups, but also by states, that these are part of the threat landscape, because it is these factors that is preventing us from implementing the solutions that are producing violence on the ground. And so if I've learned anything as Special Rapporteur over the past couple of years, it has been that unless we have holistic, comprehensive assessments of the threats to human security, we will not provide adequate solutions in the counterterrorism space to the challenges that are producing violence on the ground. Let me just finally say two things on civil society that I think we have scope to explore in this new strategy. One is that we've got past the point of saying civil society should be in the room and part of the conversation to inform member states. But I think we need listening and implementation of what civil society are telling us, and finding ways to actualize that knowledge through the process that the two ambassadors will lead, but to see, for member states to see civil society as a resource to them as they negotiate this process is very important. And finally, we have a long way to go before we recognize the full and adequate extent to which the negative effects of counterterrorism are affecting civil society actors. And the global study that my mandate will produce that accompanies this negotiation process and will be delivered to member states in June will give you that comprehensive overview of how the negative effects of counterterrorism are in fact preventing us from addressing the conditions conducive to violence. Let me close with two other remarks. The first is on new technology. The mandate I hold was really pleased to be part of the Delhi meeting and recognize the important contribution of India and other states to provoking a conversation in the counterterrorism arena about new technologies. But let's be really clear, there's a much bigger conversation happening about new technologies in the UN whole. A balanced conversation that reflects the misuse of new technologies by member states as well as by non-state groups. And we would be, I think, be deeply worrying if we were to ignore what's happening across the UN house, from the UN digital strategy to the cyber treaty, in pressing ahead normatively in the global strategy with regulation and suggestions for regulation to member states do not take account of and are not fully implementing a rule of law and human rights framework into the regulation of new technologies. And my mandate would caution strongly around that. Finally, let me say that independent oversight of counterterrorism remains an important issue for member states in this process. And just to be clear, independent oversight is not civil society oversight. That is not the job of society. Independent oversight is exactly what it means. It's member states putting in place an independent process to oversee the use of counterterrorism in the UN system. It is member states holding the UN accountable for its counterterrorism work. And to be also clear, it's not domestic oversight of states. Independent oversight is about holding the UN accountable. There are different processes to hold member states accountable for their counterterrorism work. And it's not this, but it is critically important given the vast expansion of counterterrorism in the UN system, that member states remain committed to oversight, to monitoring and evaluation, not just they get their money's worth, but also that the processes of counterterrorism within the UN themselves are fully accountable to member states. So pause there and thank you all for including me, and very glad the mandate remains at the disposal of states and of civil society to provide technical assistance and support to you in whatever way you may need throughout this process.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur, for those very clear remarks, especially in terms of framing the scope of what we mean when we call for independent oversight of the UN system. I think also the emphasis of our collective implementation of the strategy and the opportunities that provides rings very true. I'd like to turn now to Mary. Mary, you previously underscored the importance of rule of law compliant judicial tribunals and criminal investigations. What other tools should member states consider in addressing the threat of terrorism?
Thank you, Melissa. And I really want to pick off right where the Special Rapporteur left off when she said that the negative effects of counterterrorism can preclude progress toward actual counterterrorism. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with that. These measures cannot be top-down, government-imposed. They've got to be whole-of-society members. So whole-of-society measures. And so what does that mean? We know that criminal enforcement, for example, as I discussed before, of terrorism laws, it doesn't address the drivers of extremism. It doesn't address how it is spread internationally and within states. It comes too late. It comes after radicalization has occurred. So whole-of-society approaches are needed to address that. This means community-based measures, evidence-based measures that identify the grievances that create vulnerabilities to radicalizations. And those vulnerabilities, those grievances may be economic, they might be social, they might be other, and they vary from community to community and state to state. And only evidence-based research and interventions at that local level, not top-down, informed by civil society, can make progress in preventing radicalization toward violence. At a higher level, I think it's also important that we all, as a society, understand and appreciate the extent to which technology, and in particular social media, contributes to the exponential spread of disinformation, polarizing and often violent content, hateful content that is spread through algorithmic targeted amplification of that content, algorithms that are often developed by technology companies with a profit motive in mind to suck people in to more and more content that is delivered to them. This requires taking civil society's concerns into account, working with the private sector, the business sector, not just with governments to hold them accountable. It requires working with digital researchers to understand that cause and effect relationship between dehumanizing hate speech, conspiracy theories, other extremist content, and the real-world harms that we see every day in the United States where I practice and in member states. That means not just physical and mental injuries, sexual abuse, and also the undermining of democracy. Whole-of-society approaches include measures that will build resistance against disinformation, propaganda, and harmful and divisive online content. That means public-private partnerships to address the misuse of technology to spread extremism and to plot and plan attacks. But at the same time, there has to be a whole-of-society approach that informed by civil society that puts pressure and continues to ensure that our governments do not misuse technology for their own purposes to oppress those with disfavored views or to engage in civil rights or encourage civil rights violation. I agree with the Special Rapporteur that member states must be committed to oversight and evaluation of their counterterrorism measures to ensure that a whole-of-society approach is forefront in those implementation measures.
Thank you so much, Mary. I would like to close with a question to you, Rima. You have dedicated your life's work to civil society and the UN system. What is the comparative advantage of the UN in the counterterrorism domain, and what should the UN and other multilateral institutions prioritize when looking at complex conflict environments that include violent extremism?
Thank you. The United Nations and its work is a beacon of hope for millions of families and communities living in situations of war and conflict. Yet, I met men and women who were disillusioned with the United Nations and its capacity to respond to their needs. For example, a young woman told me the United Nations peace operation mission in my country did not make any difference in my life or in the lives of my sisters. We did not even feel their presence, although we see their cars. Others said, do not treat us only as victims, but we can be also agents of change and drivers of peace in our communities. Yes, the United Nations should strengthen its presence in conflict and crisis-affected countries, and also should ensure that its programs are not only accessible to people, but involve them in their design. It should use its strong convening power to hold regular town hall meetings or dialogues with local communities, civil society, women's organizations, to understand their needs, and particularly those of women and girls. The specific experience, right, needs, and roles of women and girls in conflict situations should be included in preliminary analysis of the situation of the conflict, its underlying causes, and should feed into concrete strategies for the design of the mandates and programs promoting gender equality, and it should be mainstream across all the programs and tasks. It is only then, by doing so, that we can create an enabling environment for civil society, including women's organizations, women peace builders, women's rights defenders, that to assume their vital role of preventing conflict, building peace, sustaining peace by anchoring the peace dividends in their families and in their communities. It is also essential to note that women peace builders, human rights defenders, face threats, risks, and reprisal for doing their work. It is crucial for all of us, duty bearers, member states, the UN, and all multilateral institutions to ensure their protection at all times. In all our work, let us be guided by the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and uphold its principles of sustainable development, peace and security, and human rights. Finally, my appeal to all of you, there is no better time than now to unite our strength, to change the tide of violence and build a peaceful world for all of us and the generations to come. We are accountable for the millions of people who have lost hope in humanity. Please, let us give them hope again, and thank you.
I'd like to invite us all to hold on to the energy that we're feeling in our bodies hearing those remarks for the next few months and keep that spirit alive. Thank you to this tremendous panel for your insights, your advice, your reflections, and your commitment to our shared objectives. I am now thrilled to be turning to a fantastic list of civil society representatives from around the world who will be sharing interventions from the floor. We will be running a little bit over time, but we're fortunate to have the room, and so thank you for your patience and thank you for staying as we hear from this fantastic group. We had over 50 representatives eager to make an intervention, and so we will get to as many as possible. And let us begin first with Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan, who's a human rights advocate and the former Commissioner of Human Rights of Sri Lanka. She's joining us online.
Thank you for the opportunity, Your Excellencies and colleagues. In many countries in South Asia, counter-terror legislation has been used not only to arbitrarily arrest and hold persons in administrative detention for prolonged periods, but also to discriminate, demonize, and marginalize certain communities, such as Tamils and Muslims in Sri Lanka. This has undermined social cohesion and created social instability, thereby exacerbating the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. In Sri Lanka, after the Easter Sunday attacks, there's been a conflation of the rights-busting triad: radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism, which have entered the lexicon of the security apparatus, thereby enabling the creation of legally undefined and uncodified nebulous offenses, which are used to justify arbitrary state action that violates human rights. For instance, protests and demands for justice by the families of the disappeared are deemed a threat to national security and are subject to both formal and informal restrictions. Following the election of Gotabaya Rajapaksa as president in 2019 in Sri Lanka, civil society groups and activists, particularly those working in the conflict-affected north and east of Sri Lanka, experienced a sharp increase in monitoring and scrutiny by security entities such as the Terrorist Investigation Division. Moreover, the rhetoric of government activists equates activists working on human rights as terrorists or enablers of terrorism, which results in self-censorship by civil society. The government has also continuously attempted to create a nexus between NGOs and security threats, claiming that foreign funds are being dispersed to local groups to radicalize ethnic minorities who engage in illegal activities that threaten national security. Since early 2020, the Terrorism Investigation Division has been summoning several civil society organizations, particularly those in the North and the East, for inquiry regarding foreign remittances they have received to support their work. They do this by weaponizing administrative directions and laws related to terror financing. To date, no evidence of wrongdoing by these organizations has been found. Successive governments have also portrayed the drug problem as a national security issue and used it to increase the involvement of the military in drug control and even drug rehabilitation. The government conflates the drug issue with countering violent extremism to enact egregious legislation and expand the powers of the security forces and police. This has been entrenched by the Bureau of Rehabilitation Act enacted in 2022. Recommendations, it is imperative that we adopt an intersectional gendered approach in assessing and responding to the impact of counterterrorism on civil society, including in the legislative drafting process. Civil society groups, activists should be consulted by bilateral and multilateral agencies to gain an understanding of the local context and to identify areas and activities where financial resources should be invested. Their advice and concerns should be taken into account through their inclusion from the inception stage of projects. Finally, I reiterate the Special Rapporteur's call for the establishment of an independent internal oversight mechanism for oversight and accountability of ways in which the United Nations counterterrorism efforts incorporate relevant human rights, rule of law, and gender equality standards. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambika, and also for joining us at this late hour in Sri Lanka. Our next speaker is Hussein Khalid, joining us from Kenya, where he's the Executive Director of Haki Africa.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and it's an honor to be here today to speak to you and share perspectives from Africa. For us, human rights and fundamental freedoms and the need to promote these while countering violent extremism cannot be overemphasized. In Africa, countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Mozambique, Egypt, and many others are continuously fighting to ensure that constitutional right guarantees that our people's fundamental freedoms are continuously being respected by respective governments. We're seeing across the world shrinking civic space drastically in the name of fighting terrorism. all over, whether it's in Mozambique, where we have the Daesh, whether it's in Somalia, which is now spreading to the Eastern Africa with the Al-Shabaab, or whether it's in Nigeria with the Boko Haram. We are seeing governments more using terror legislation to clamp down on civil society and to try and address these issues from a security perspective. In every corner of Africa, in Egypt, for example, we have seen a number of journalists being arrested, being thrown into prisons in the name of fighting terrorism, while in actual sense, it's actually silencing dissent. Whether it's in South Africa, there's xenophobic attacks that we continue to experience. We are seeing more and more the government using terror legislation to try and address some of these issues that are emerging from our communities. In Tanzania, even when issues very clearly matters to do with land, matters to do with socioeconomic issues, the government is also deciding to use terror legislation to clamp down and to silence those who are speaking up against the negative government practices that are being employed in addressing some of these concerns. So for us, as Africans and people who want to come together to promote democracy, to promote human rights, and more so to truly fight violent extremism and terrorism in our communities, we are more and more drifting apart and seeing the gap widening between civil society and the state because of these repressive mechanisms, these repressive processes that are being used by governments across the continent to silence critics. The effects of counterterrorism are affecting civil society in Africa drastically. We are now seeing governments borrowing from each other legislation to cut down on for civil society. They're saying, as has been said by the previous speaker, Ambika, that foreign governments are coming in to support civil society and in the long run to promote terrorism and violent extremism in the communities. The issue of LGBTQ, even in Kenya and Uganda, is now looked at from an angle of counterterrorism. So we're seeing more and more governments using counterterrorism legislation to not only silence critics, but also to take away fundamental rights and freedoms that have already been guaranteed by different countries in their constitutions. In terms of moving forward, as Haki Africa, we were lucky to receive support from the Global Center to attend the Malaga conference, where I was honored to co-moderate a session. And we feel that, moreover, there is more need now globally for states and civil society to come together to address just counterterrorism, but actually the whole UN mechanism. We know for a fact that, for people to move together and to be able to address their concerns, no single entity, state or otherwise, can truly and sufficiently address all these issues. So we see the counterterrorism initiatives as a very good opportunity for us to introduce a whole of society approach to the UN system so that we can collectively work together to address the concerns that are emerging from different parts of this world. We believe that as the counterterrorism effort and has been very well expressed by Madam Fionnuala, the UN Special Rapporteur on promoting human rights while countering terrorism, the Malaga experience showed us that when civil society works together closely with the UN mechanism to address these concerns, particularly the counterterrorism, which has now spiraled out of control and is being used by states to repress communities, if we work together, then we can be better, respond to the emerging concerns wherever they arise. And I think the upcoming conference in Nigeria by the UNOCT is one clear avenue we can adopt to, include civil society in not just the sessions, but also in preparing, in planning, and making sure that all issues are brought into account. As Haki Africa, we also believe that as civil society, we play vital roles in our society, and we can better address these issues before the UN and state parties so that they can address the issues as they are represented, directly from the people who are bearing the brunt of the excesses of the states and the security agencies that are there. I think that, together and with efforts that are bringing all actors in one strategy, we should be able to address the many concerns that communities across the world are suffering from. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hussein. I'm now turning to Letta Taylor from Human Rights Watch.
I'm here to address the detentions of foreigners held as ISIS suspects and family members in northeast Syria. I commend the Secretary General for calling out in his report on UN member states to urgently redouble their efforts to address this crisis, because this is indeed a crisis of global proportions. 42,000 foreigners, men, women, and children from 60 countries are entering their 5th year of unlawful detention in northeast Syria as ISIS suspects and family members. They're held inside a war zone. Most of these detainees are children who never chose to live under ISIS. My father told me he was taking me to Disneyland. One 17-year-old boy told me, who I met in one of these detention centers in northeast Syria. This boy has spent half his life in detention, first under ISIS and now under anti-ISIS forces. I have been to the camps and prisons in northeast Syria that are holding these detainees. I can attest that, that their conditions are life-threatening, deeply degrading, and often inhuman. Children are murdered by ISIS hardliners in the camps. They are run over by water trucks. They are sexually abused. They are dying from easily treatable diseases, and they are burned to death in tent fires. When they reach adolescence, many boys are wrested from their mothers and held separately in detention centers. I have spoken to mothers who have no idea where their boys are, and I've spoken to boys who've told me they've gone months or years without any contact whatsoever with their family members. None of these detainees has been charged with a crime locally. None have even had access to a court. Pillar 1 of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy speaks of conditions conducive to terrorism, such as human rights abuses. The abuses that these detainees are facing undoubtedly make them more vulnerable to the siren call of ISIS recruiters who are very busy in the camps and trying very hard to break out hardliners. Pillar 4 of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy says that human rights and the rule of law are cornerstones of UN counterterrorism efforts. Yet these detentions throw rights to the winds. Children are collectively punished for the acts of their parents, children who are victims of ISIS themselves. Meanwhile, adults who have committed ISIS atrocities are not held to account, and this is a slap in the face to victims of ISIS crimes. The UN system should address this crisis by redoubling its own efforts to improve conditions for these detainees while solutions are being addressed to bring detainees home, which is the only durable solution. The UN system should redouble pressure on countries to repatriate their nationals for rehabilitation, for reintegration, and for, of course, prosecutions as appropriate. No rehabilitation is happening, any genuine rehabilitation, in these camps and prisons. Reintegration is impossible. Reintegration to what? Inside a desert prison. No prosecutions are happening either. As part of the process of pressing countries to repatriate their nationals, the UN should work hard to encourage member states to include strong repatriation language in the 10th Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review. Weaker language suggests that member states are acquiescent in these unlawful detentions, and by extension, it suggests that the entire UN system is acquiescent in these unlawful detentions too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Letta. I'd now like to invite Ms. Wajma Frog of the Afghan Women and Peace Studies Organization.
Thank Thank you so much. It's an honor to be in this conversation. And I very much think I hope that, these conversations will actually be put into action. Just quickly, I work in Afghanistan with a group of 215 peace builders, women peace builders in 34 provinces. And right now, they are actively engaging in their communities, identifying the challenges and threats that are still there. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan in August 2021, the world thought that the war has ended in Afghanistan. But the level of activities by a number of foreign terrorist organizations in different parts of the country is alarming. And that's what women are telling me. What we hear in different parts of the country in terms of the activities by terrorist organizations that from the Central Asian countries, as well as many other, international terrorist organizations that are not being contained by the Taliban Emirate. At the same time, and sadly, while the international community does not have a presence in Afghanistan, UNAMA is one of the only international communities' presence and institution in Afghanistan. But sadly, we do not see UNAMA actually engaging with civil society on these early warnings. The women organizations, with all the risks to their lives, are continuing their activities, like these 215 women that I work with. And they are the ones who are the early warnings. They are telling us about the security challenges, as well as the violent extremism, how the younger boys are being trained in the northern parts of Afghanistan by ETIM, for example, East Turkestan militants, or, for example, in the north of the country. But we do not hear the UN agencies actually to even monitor the situation. At the same time, there is a huge lack of the UN frameworks being implemented UN agencies in Afghanistan, like the 1325. How are Afghan women? Yes, the Taliban have banned the women for everything, from even breathing anymore, but the UN agencies are not engaging with women organizations. Who are on the ground, we do not hear a single consultation with women organizations on how to actually implement 1325 within the UN mandates inside the country, and within the humanitarian, for example, programs, or any other interventions. You do not find a single women organization on the UN country team in Afghanistan. And these are the realities on the ground. We see all these international UN resolutions, and particularly around women, peace and security, but the UN agencies on the ground are finding it very hard or not able to actually implement it on the ground. So I hope that that is a message that I wanted to share from the 215 women that I work with in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wajma. I'd like to now turn to Lorianne Thuhu-Benoni from the Institute for Security Studies.
Thank you for the floor. As an African organization that conducts independent research, provides technical support, and offers capacity building to states and regional organizations, I would like to draw the attention of all member states on the urgent need to mobilize political and financial resources to address the expanding terrorism threat in Africa. The report of the Secretary General correctly points to the fact that terrorist activities continue to increase and spread on the African continent, with clear intensification in West Africa and the Sahel, which is the region I work on. The report also emphasizes that the threat is reaching areas such as the north of Gulf of Guinea countries. If you look at maps that illustrates the expansion of security incidents attributed to terrorist organizations in the region over the past decade, it is clear that if that trend continues for another decade, no West African countries will be spared. It is not too late, but the prevention window is closing fast in some areas, and there is a need to make sure that PVE and CT measures implemented are designed based on lessons learned and empirical data. The current analysis of the threat expansion focuses disproportionately on visible security incident, which, our research shows, is really only the tip of the iceberg. The invisible part of the iceberg that requires a lot more attention is about how terrorist groups get their recruits, funding, and operational means. Developing such detailed, evidence-based understanding is key for affected countries and member states, such as member state in this room, and the various UN entities represented here to implement adequate policy intervention. And this is something CSOs, research organizations, and think tanks can contribute to. Only such evidence-based analysis of the threat can ensure that calibrated military and security interventions are located within larger, context-specific strategies that include both kinetic and non-kinetic tools within the prevention and CT toolbox, such as political, development, socioeconomic, and governance intervention. I would like to end with a very basic request by urging all member states participating in this process to ensure that efforts are driven towards impacting as much as possible the situation on the ground. And I thank you very much for your kind attention and for the opportunity to address this forum.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to our final intervention from the floor by Ashley Subramanian Montgomery of the Charity and Security Network. Ashley, the floor is yours.
Thank you to the Global Center for hosting this high-level event, to the permanent representatives of Canada and Tunisia, Ambassadors Robert Ray and Tariq Ladeb, to fellow civil society colleagues, and to the Honorable Special Rapporteur. Today, we are here to reflect on the report of the Secretary General on activities of the United Nations system in implementing the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. We are all well aware of how overly broad and vague counterterrorism measures negatively impact civil society and disrupt their operating environment. And we know that disruptions to civil society's operating environment are really disruptions to the conditions conducive to combating terrorist threats. As the Special Rapporteur has diligently noted throughout her mandate, counterterrorism measures are inherently gendered, and while some progress has been made, counterterrorism still lacks truly intersectional gender analysis and integration. As we sit in this very ECOSOC chamber, all around us are meetings for the Commission on the Status of Women, the largest civil society gathering to advance women's rights and gender equality. Yesterday was International Women's Day. This month is Women's History Month. If we don't move from recognition and rhetoric to action and accountability for the women, girls, and sexual and gender minorities who continue to be disproportionately impacted by counterterrorism measures now, then when will we? We don't need the mere recognition of the importance of women's leadership and expertise in countering terrorism. We need the women who experience the most marginalization to not only be in the rooms where decisions are being made, but to be the ones making these decisions. We don't need the expansion of counterterrorism budgets. We need the expansion of protections from reprisals for civil society actors who engage with the UN. We don't need more resources poured into the UN's counterterrorism architecture. We need the existing architecture to embody, embrace, and integrate intersectional gender, human rights, and rule of law-based approaches. As our member state colleagues go into upcoming and ongoing negotiations, I urge you to be brave in the language and demands you ask for and the lead up to the adoption of the 8th UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. When you make your asks, remember those most impacted by counterterrorism and the power you have to create change for them. It's not a guarantee that all of your asks will make it into the final strategy, but it is a guarantee that anything you don't ask for won't make it in. Be brave in your asks. Be bold in your asks. And remember that your asks are not only for the UN, not only for member states, and not even only for civil society. Your asks are for those whose faces you will likely never see, and whose voices you will likely never hear, but whose lives will undoubtedly be impacted by how the UN chooses to implement counterterrorism. Ask for them. We have months to go before we sleep. The time is now. Ask for them.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I've been asked by one of our colleagues in Beirut who has stayed up to make a very brief remark, so please allow me to turn to Odette Chestnut from the Lebanese Association of Victims of Terrorism before I turn to Rafi Gregorian, the Deputy to the Undersecretary General of UNOCT.
Thank you. Only to share our experience with UNODC. Since 2018, the Lebanese Association of Victims of Terrorism has entered into a partnership with UNODC to collaborate in Iraq. The collaboration was based on three pillars. Firstly, supporting victims during the legal procedure. Secondly, raising awareness among judges about the needs of victims, particularly during confrontation between female victims of sexual violence and their aggressor. And thirdly, strengthening the capacity of youth activists on the ground to better adapt their actions in preventing violent extremism. This collaboration has been beneficial for everyone. On the one hand, UNODC provided its logistical expertise and used its contact with the Iraqi government and the legal system. For our part, as a civil society organization, we have brought our experience in the field and our specialized expertise in supporting victims during legal proceedings. These partnerships was also beneficial for the victim because they were able to have direct contact with the justice system. Collaborating between civil society and the UN can lead to more effective outcomes on the ground. Civil society organizations often have a deep understanding of local communities and their needs, while the UN can bring global expertise and resources. By working together, they can leverage their strengths to achieve better outcomes. Collaboration between civil society and the UN can also help to enhance the legitimacy of both parties. This partnership should be applied more often and should start from the early stage of discussion on resolution through to their implementation on the ground. Thank you to give me the floor, but I wanted to emphasize its importance to work together from the beginning until the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Odette. And so it is called on in the strategy itself to involve civil society in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of all UN programming. With this, I have the pleasure of handing the floor over to Rafi Gregorian to share some final remarks. Rafi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and to the panelists and the speakers. I could find a way to say over the next 3 minutes that I agree with everything I've heard, but that would be a waste of your time and mine. I do want to strongly emphasize and draw attention to what Fionnuala said. I want to reflect for a moment on why it is important that civil society be involved in this. You know, it's not just intrinsically good to have inclusivity. There's real benefit to this, and I think, Mary, you mentioned this as well, about effective responses. So what has changed over the last 20, 30 years in terrorism is moving away from small groups of radicals, 20, 30 people who present a threat in terms of targeted assassinations or bombings, to what are today's terrorist insurgencies of tens of thousands of fighters that are holding and administering territory. So you can attack the terrorist tactics, but you're not addressing the issue if you're not going after the insurgency, which typically have these political goals behind them. And all this is occurring and developing at the same time as what the Secretary General has pointed out in his report on our common agenda, the breakdown of the social contract between the governed and the governing. And all this has been accelerated in very negative ways by misuse of social media along the lines of what Mary was describing earlier. So, my surprise, coming into this job about 3.5 years ago was I thought I'd be focusing on terrorist abuses of human rights, and instead we have spent quite a lot of time focusing on violations of human rights by states. And this has been very well documented by UNDP, for example, in 2 different studies on the journey to extremism, on what are the triggers that often force people to take up violence against authorities. We've also seen and heard today, as we did in Malaga, extensive examples about the shrinking of civic space. And this is, in my view, fundamentally acts of frustration by governments that don't know how to deal with these terrorist insurgencies, which then result in futility and then cracking down on the things that they can crack down on rather than going after the actual threat. So if you're going to fight a successful insurgency, whether it's a terrorist one or not, you really need a whole of society response. And that's where civil society comes into play. They are on the front lines in terms of being the victims, but they're also the front lines in terms of being the solution, because you have to win the hearts and minds of everyone, and that means fundamentally civil society. On the UN side, I think I've seen personally my own time working on these issues, a very important evolution over the past, almost 9 years now, with introduction of Security Council Resolution 2178, and there were 4 or 5 operative paragraphs with the headline of countering violent extremism, and that's where it first really started articulating not just the concept of CVE in the field of practice of counterterrorism and foreign terrorist fighters in that particular issue, but also the role of civil society and women and youth and others in terms of being part of the solution. And we've made a lot of progress, frankly, in the subsequent years. The 7th review of 2021, which has been mentioned multiple times here, really was a landmark. It's the high watermark so far in terms of human rights, civil society, victims of terrorism. Aletta even mentions inadequate mentions of the children in Al Hol, but hopefully there'll be more to come on that in this 8th review. But what we do see, and what you're experiencing and explaining here, and we heard in Malaga, is the disconnect between what member states are agreeing to in the General Assembly and the Security Council in terms of whole society responses and the role of civil society and the shrinking of civic space, and what's actually being practiced on the ground by some member states. So they need to understand, we have to help them understand that what they're doing is counterproductive in those regards. So what are we doing to advance all this? Well, a mention has already been made of the Malaga conference. The outcomes of that are included as an annex in the Secretary General's report. As Finola did, I would encourage everyone to read that. But what we've been doing for the past few years is making sure that we get to hear from civil society in both the inputs for the Secretary General's reports. We first started doing this at the end of 2019 and have done it ever since. That very first time, we had more inputs from civil society organizations than we did from member states. So think about that. You're clearly invested in the process, and we're really grateful for that. The other thing is, of course, ways in which we can implement it here within the United Nations. We have the Global Compact, Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, set up by the Secretary General in 2018. It has 8 working groups, one of which is co-chaired by OHCHR. It's the working group on human rights and rule of law. In UNOCT itself, we set up in 2022 the Human Rights and Gender section. One of its major functions is to mainstream human rights and gender considerations into all of our work, as well as to help us implement the human rights due diligence policy in terms of our programming and the application of that programming. And thanks to the General Assembly's generous approval of the conversion of voluntary to regular budget funding for about 25 of our positions, including some of those in the Human Rights and Gender section, they now officially approved the Human Rights and Gender section as part of the organization of UNOCT. In terms of civil society engagement, we of course have the Civil Society Roundtable series, which I chair. We have evolved that over the past few iterations to now include direct dialogue and discussion between our program management officers who run the programs that we have and interested civil society actors so that we can get their views on it. And my goal is that as programs come up for renewal, that we have these conversations and then they are built into the design or redesign of programs going forward. There are, of course, some, was mentioned, I think, what I would call horizontal integration issues, the concerns about silos and how CT, frankly, is siloed, even though we have 45 members taking part in the Global Compact. So we do want to follow the Secretary General's exhortation to us to pursue horizontal integration, but we need the help of the member states to do this in the 8th review. And all these things will be factored in to the drafting of the new agenda for peace, which came out of our Common Agenda report, including those issues related to technology, both the threats they pose in terms of terrorist use of those technologies, but also the very real and very scary abuse of those same technologies by state actors. So let me stop there and just again thank all the speakers for their contribution. I found it very valuable, as was this event organized by Global Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us here in the room and online for this important conversation. A special thanks to our speakers and all the interventions that were made, to the co-facilitators for your ongoing support, to the Global Center team, Adele and Annabelle, for their tremendous work, and to all the technicians, the interpreters, everyone that it took to make this possible. It's clear that civil society stands ready to engage with member states, with the UN, and we look forward to facilitating that throughout the 8th review. Thank you very much, everyone.